Jason, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for the invitation for an interview, Daniel.
Well, thank you also for signing a copy of your new book, which is where I'd like to start the conversation. And really to, first of all, just pause and thank you for all of your hard work over the years that has done so much to shed light on the evolution of yoga practice and the context in which yoga has evolved. And I've found that very helpful personally, and I'm sure I'm not alone. And I think really ought to acknowledge just what a broad sweep of history we're talking about, because a lot of people may have come across your work looking at the evolution of postural practice in particular, and that sort of influences modern yoga, the kind of yoga making shapes on mats that everybody in the wider world is more familiar with. But this is going right back to the very beginning of physical yoga practice, effectively, or certainly the systematization of doing things with the body to go to a state beyond the mind, and calling that Hatha yoga and Raja yoga. So, you're at both ends of the spectrum, really, of the evolution of physical yoga practice in your research. And, there aren't many scholars who do that sort of thing. So I salute you, is what I'd like to start by saying. But then I'd also like to
Well,
dive into this text. Go ahead.
well,
Sorry.
thanks for your kind words. I mean, it's really your interest and that of others in the research that makes it worthwhile. If I were just, I suppose I do the research for myself to some degree. I have questions, and so I go searching for answers. But really, the greater satisfaction of research, writing, the talks, and so forth, and even these interviews, is to interact with people who are also interested in the history and the same questions. And yeah, it makes the whole path, so much more worthwhile.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad, and really, that's the sort of, I guess, the rich terrain that yoga studies has entered in recent years. That there is an enormous practitioner community with increasing interest in, understanding what scholars have been working on. At the same time, that there's been an increased interest in, researching these subjects, and so all that's come
Mm.
together. And there's such a wealth of publications now that it's very hard to keep up with them all. One has to pick one's sort of area of interest almost, otherwise there's too much to read. And yeah, I'd
Yeah,
like
that's
to
true, isn't it?
yeah,
It's very different to 10 years ago, isn't it? When
exactly. Yeah, there was a time when I felt like I had it all on my hard drive, but I don't think I do anymore. Certainly not in my head.
Yes, and it's great that there are scholars from so many different fields looking at yoga and coming at it from different perspectives, whether it's anthropology, religious studies, Indology, or now, of course, more studies being done on yoga in particular countries. I just read the other day an article on the sort of way yoga became popular in China in the 1970s,
Hmm.
which is quite interesting. So there's certainly greater diversity now in the research that's being done on yoga than what we've seen in the past.
But I do feel then that also makes it almost overwhelming for a particular yoga practitioner to start engaging with. So, yeah, what I often am trying to do in my own work is to build a bridge between the curious outsider and what I know as a curious outsider on the world of scholarship, and trying to sort of relate the two worlds to one another, and also actually just keeping it in some ways anchored in the spirit of a practitioner's curiosity about what they're doing. And obviously, the later phase of yoga history that you focused on is of immediate interest to people because, if they've heard anything about the history of yoga, it's that what we take for granted as being yoga today is not what yoga has been for much of its evolution. And you're able to shed some light on, where some postures come from, how they become joined together into sequences, and
Mm.
how that may have inspired innovative modern teachers. But when we go back to the earlier part of the story, it starts to sound a little bit different, and that might be where we can dive into the Amaraugha, this first of all book. I should congratulate you on publishing. the fruits of the research work of the Hatha Yoga project, translating a number of old texts about physical yoga practice that will help to give us a much richer understanding of what there was up to 1,000 years ago in the way of teachings on things to do with the body to go beyond the mind, and that's the focus here. So the genesis of Hatha and Raja Yoga is the subtitle. So the real foundations of these two systems, which I'm sure you'll say a little bit more about in a moment. But it's the title that intrigues me, Amaraugha, sort of lineage of immortals. And the immediate question I would have is, what does that mean? What does it mean to be immortal in the sense of early Hatha and Raja Yoga practice? I've heard you talk about sort of semi-catatonic states of meditation, and it makes me wonder about a zombie-like undead state of just sort of beyond the beyond. Is that the kind of thing they're getting at, or is there something else embedded in the title?
Well, I think it's referring to the lineage of siddhas. The text is attributed to Gorakṣanātha,
Mm.
and he, of course, was one of the founding um, master yogis, if you like. That's what a siddha means, of this type of yoga, Hatha and Raja Yoga. Um, uh, and yes, they sort of aimed for immortality in a very literal sense, if you like, no death, no old age, disease, and the like. So really the Amaraugha, the word Amaraugha, which means a stream of immortals, really refers to the teachings of that lineage. And as the text itself says, really the most important teaching is Raja Yoga. So Raja Yoga and Amaraugha become synonymous in a sense. And Raja Yoga in this text means samadhi, a meditative state where there's no mental activity. That's how it defines it, very similarly to Patanjali in Sutra 1.2, which is Chittavritti Nirodha. Here in the Amaraugha, we have Chittavritti Rahita. So without, Raja Yoga is without mental activity. And that's the aim of the system of yoga that's taught in this early Siddha text. So yes, that's really what the word Amaraugha means. With regard to what you were saying, what does immortality, what may have that been like, or how might that have been conceived? That's something that this text, which is sort of very terse, very short, it's only 46 verses, doesn't give us a lot of insight into. To answer a question like that, one really needs to look at the corpus of yoga texts more broadly to sort of see how
Mm.
liberation was conceived. In the Amaraugha, it's a little ambiguous. In some texts, like the Amanasika, it seems that the yogi stays suspended in a state of samadhi, perhaps for the rest of his or her life, which, as you insinuated in your question, is a sort of like a sort of a stone-like immortality that may not be much fun in the minds of some aspiring yogis. But in other texts, it's clear that the yogi emerges from samadhi and can live in the world with, lots of siddhis, lots of powers. And that, of course, is a very alluring prospect of having, not only immortality, freedom from old age and death, but being able to live as one pleases with all sorts of supernatural powers. That would probably get those who are, who want more than samadhi into the practice, that promise anyway.
Although I guess as a modern practitioner with a little bit of a critical thinking faculty engaged, one might immediately say, where are these characters from the 12th
Aha.
century in order to demonstrate the validity of this claim?
Well, that's not a new question, I don't think, because as you probably know, with the Amrita Siddhi, that question was probably at the back of the author's mind, and he makes it
Yeah.
quite clear there that the immortal yogi, becomes invisible because he completely controls Prakriti, the elements within the body, and so can become invisible at will. And that's a theme that continues through to the Yoga Bija, where through the fire of yogi, the body is purified and becomes very subtle in its form, like ether, like akasha, air or space, but even more pure than that. And so cannot be discerned even by the gods, according to the relevant verse of the Yoga Bija. So these yogis are alive among us, but we don't necessarily see them. But they can manifest, because they've got control over prakriti, they can manifest themselves, who knows, maybe even during this interview, to point out, if I make a incorrect statement or something like that. Or I think the general scenario is, if they want to teach somebody, then they can appear at a given moment, pass on the teaching, and that's often used, I think, as a mechanism for how lineages can regenerate themselves. If a particular yogi claims to receive teachings from a famous guru or siddha in the past, at a later point. So yes, it's a handy explanation.
Well, I guess then that raises another question, which is how to reconcile sort of two different ways of seeing. One being an understanding of the worldview that texts are communicating, and the other being, an understanding of the world as we inhabit it in 2024 at the time of speaking. And I wonder, as a scholar, obviously you're kind of responsibility in some ways is to the text. You're trying to clarify, first of all, what it actually says, and then, perhaps what that actually means. But at the same time, to an audience, there is also that other way of seeing that comes up. And I remember at the launch of your book, somebody was asking you about, how seriously do we take these claims? Can you become immortal? And I wonder how you reconcile those two perspectives when you're trying to engage with those sorts of claims in this material.
Yeah, I don't worry too much about it. I don't trying to reconcile them. As you sort of pointed out in your question, I feel my primary role is to understand and then communicate what I think the text is saying.
Mm.
And to a large degree, to do that, I've got to forget, or at least put to the back of my mind, a lot of modern conceptions and assumptions that we make about life, because the 12th century, when the Amaraugha was written, was a very different world, and people living at that time had different beliefs. So I try to get into that mindset if I can, and at the same time, I try and read the text, which, in many cases, and the Amaraugha is no exception, needs restoration. These
Mm.
texts don't come down to us after 800 years in their original form. They're full of problems. They have verses that don't make sense, grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes, words that have perhaps been changed but don't really make sense. And of course, when we compare manuscripts, we see different readings for the same verse. So there's a lot of the detail, I suppose, that I'm immersed in is trying to work out those technicalities so that I can restore the text and have something that's presentable.
And just to
Something that
clarify
I
for anyone who doesn't know about manuscripts, that's partly because there isn't such a thing as the text from the 12th century. There are manuscripts that have been copied, and
Mm.
different places have stored slightly different readings because of the way that the manuscripts have been replicated. Is that accurate to say? Or?
Absolutely. No,
Yeah.
and that's certainly important to point out. And the Amaraugha is a good example of how manuscripts can vary, because before I started this research, we thought the text was called the Amaraughaprabodha and had 75 verses. After collecting more manuscripts, I found two that had 46 verses, and the text was called the Amaraugha. And this shorter version was clearly related to the longer version. It's just that the longer version had more material that was added. So I then had 2 manuscripts of the short version and 4 of the longer version. There were variations in, within those manuscripts themselves or between the manuscripts themselves, but then big variation between the 2 recensions. So I then had to try and work out, what happened there, which was one earlier and the other created from it, or vice versa. And I think I hope I've made a fairly compelling argument that the Amaraugha, the short version, which is the focus of the book, really, even though I also present an edition and translation of the Amaraughaprabodha, in terms of the history, the Amaraugha is far more important, because it's the early version of the text, the original version. I hope I presented a compelling argument for why I think that's the case, why the short version was original and how material was added to it to create the long version.
As I understood it, one of the most compelling, arguments for that was it's a lot more coherent, and
Yeah,
you get a much, closer focus, sharper focus on what's actually innovative there, rather than padding and explanation and some extra details.
that's right. Yeah, when material's added, and particularly if it's added a little haphazardly, it can obscure the original work. And so, as soon as I looked at the short version, one of the first things I saw was a clearer structure to the text. To give an example, there's a question that prompts the discussion of the 4 types of yoga. There's a question, how is Rajayoga taught with other types, such as Laya and Mantra yoga? And that's, of course, the focus of the text is teaching 4 types of yoga: Mantra, Laya, Haṭha, and Rajayoga. And
We
in the
just
long
clarify for
version,
anyone listening who doesn't know what liar means. How would you describe liar? Mantra, people have probably figured out, but liar.
yes, yes. So mantras are the repetition of a mantra. Laya literally means dissolution of the mind here. So
Hmm.
it's a sort of a meditative practice. In this case, visualizing nectar flowing in the body and Shiva in the form of a linga that brings about dissolution of the mind or a meditative state. Yes, so that's the focus of the text, these 4 types of yoga. And the question in both recensions is, how is Raja Yoga taught with these other yogas? And then the long recension goes into an explanation of the 4 types of student, which is quite, it's about maybe half a dozen verses or so. And then you get the explanation of the 4 types of yoga. Whereas in the short recension, the passage on the 4 types of student is not there. So you immediately get the answer that you would be expecting. That is an explanation of Mantra, Laya, and Hatha yoga. So that's one example how the structure of the text becomes clearer in the short recension. Another example is the section on Rajayoga, which is sort of much longer, if you like, in the longer recension. It has most of the extra verses in that section. It's very discursive, and some of the verses don't really seem to relate to the rest of the text, like a practice on trying to retain the elements within the body to prolong life, which sort of relates to the theme of immortality. You could sort of see why someone might want to put that in, but why would you put that into the section on Raja Yoga when you've actually, done a lot of the other yogas for, reaching the point of samadhi, and you would expect that the practice of samadhi and Raja Yoga alone would bring about liberations. Well, suddenly you get this practice in the long recension on retaining 5 elements within the body that brings about immortality. And then it quotes the longer recension quotes other texts. So it's a compilation. So the redactor of the long recension was not writing material in by themselves. They were taking it from different texts, such as the Amanaskar and the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. Then as soon as we see that going on in the text, you realize that it's not an original work, and it's probably coming, later in the canon, later in the corpus. Which is why when we started the Hatha Yoga project, we didn't think the Amaraughaprabodha was one of the earliest texts. We sort of thought maybe it's 14th century. it had interesting material, so we'll include it nonetheless. And then as soon as we found the Amaraugha and had an original text, and it was very close to the Amrita Siddhi, then all of a sudden I realized that, gosh, this could be one of the earliest texts on Hatha and Raja Yoga with this fourfold system. And that opened up all sorts of interesting questions, like, well, then, why did the author of the Amaraugha borrow physical techniques and 4 stages of yoga from a Buddhist Vajrayana tradition, call it Hatha, and integrate it into this text? Well, what was going on? What was the relationship between those two traditions at that time? So we sort of had at that point a much more solid foundation for the development of Hatha and Raja Yoga, which is why I called the book The Genesis of Hatha and Raja Yoga, because until we had the Amaraugha, the relationship between the Amrita Siddhi, which is an early work, 11th century, it's dated, there's a very old manuscript of that. And and the texts that follow that it had some influence on, such as the Amaraughaprabodha at the time, and then the Shiva Samhita, they were quite remote, 4 or 5 centuries. At the time, we thought the Amaraughaprabodha was 14th century, Shiva Samhita, well, I still think it's probably 15th century. But then when we had the Amaraugha at hand, suddenly we had a text that could have been composed very close to the Amrita Siddhi. So we're sort of right there when these two traditions are interacting with one another, Vajrayana Buddhism and Shaivism from within the Siddha tradition. And yeah, suddenly for me, it opened up a sort of new avenue, if you like, of seeing the early history of Hatha and Raja Yoga, and then how that developed afterwards through to the Hatha Pradipika, where these 4 yogas taught in the Amaraugha become basically Hatha and Raja Yoga.
So it really is the bridge from the earliest conception of doing stuff with the body to attain transcendent states, to that sort of later synthesis of all of the ways in which you might do that. That is the Pradipika, which is almost the sort of springboard for what evolves into postural yoga. That's the first time that postures get put into the mix in that way. But here we don't have postures in the mix. So we're talking about Hatha yoga in a slightly different form. I'll let you come in just a moment. I just wanted to clarify one other thing. Amrita Siddhi, this is the earliest text that teaches techniques that are replicated here in this text, the Amaraugha. And as you say, composed by Buddhists. And that's often a surprising thing for people to hear, because they don't think of Hatha yoga, physical yoga practice, as being something that came from a different tradition. They tend to associate it with people like Gorakṣanātha, who is the purported author of this text. So it's interesting to find that bridge building exercise, but also to think about what the titles both mean. Amrita Siddhi is a similar sort of allusion to a state of immortality, isn't it? So there is this general interest in getting into some otherworldly state that takes you out of the problems of this life, and that's actually what yoga was always about, in a way, is transcending the problems of this world, and it's suddenly bringing the body into the process of doing that, which wasn't there before. It was largely ignore the body. The body keeps you involved in the world, and here we've got suddenly ways of working with the body, and that can be part of dealing with the problem of the world.
Yes. I mean, that's what I wanted to respond to, your comment about the early practice, because that was another light bulb that went off when, looking at the Amrita Siddhi and the Amaraugha together, is we had this very basic practice, physical practice, called Hatha Yoga, involving the 3 mudras and how they could be done sequentially. And even though that's there in later texts to some extent, such as the Haṭha Pradipika, the Haṭha Pradipika says that the 3 mudras should be done together. For some reason, in the Amaraugha and the Amrita Siddhi, the sort of sequential practice and how these 3 mudras with the bandhas that are necessary for the practice of them, how they sort of formed a tight unit if you like. And that tight unit was the sort of a rudimentary early physical practice.
Mm.
For me, I didn't see that until you know the until I sort of realized this connection between the Amrita Siddhi and the Amaraugha as being a very early formulation of Hatha Yoga. And
Could
that
you
I
just
find
clarify? Sorry, go
fascinating.
ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I find that fascinating, that we may have come across, one of the earliest forms of physical practice called Hatha Yoga, that it's basically this sequential practice of the three mudras. That for me, that um, was fantastic. I sort of thought, wow. And then, of course, then you can start to see how other things got added, how, the
Yeah.
two bandhas that are with the practice within those three mudras, suddenly you get a third bandha, Uddiyana,
Mm.
and then you get, more mudras added to make a corpus of 10. And then, of course, by the time you get to the Hatha Pradipika, you've got asanas and pranayama being added as separate auxiliaries. So you can sort of see how the physical practice starts to grow from the 12th century to the 15th century. And then, of course, that process continues after the 15th century with more asanas and pranayamas and so forth coming into the mix.
Oh, thank you. And just was struck by the inclusion in your launch presentation of a video in which you show just how coherent this system of three mudras is by demonstrating them. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But for now, I wonder, for those who haven't seen that, if you could just clarify what's meant by these three mudras. Obviously, there's a word mudra that's often associated with making hand gestures, but these aren't hand gestures. They are physical
Mm.
positions in which something is being manipulated inside the body. And I wonder if you could just explain briefly how that works.
Yes, yes. Well, firstly, I'm quite happy to send you the video so you can share it with
Oh, that would be
whoever
great. Thank you. Yeah. Mm.
might want to watch it. Because seeing it, the reason I did the demonstration is because seeing it is in some ways so it makes it so much easier to understand the practice than reading the verses in the text
Mm.
itself. Um, and funnily enough, the way the practice is described in the Amaraugha is more obscure and terse than what it is in the Amrita Siddhi.
Mm.
So to understand the practice, it really requires reading both texts or knowledge of both texts. And even then, of course, when you go to do it physically, and I'm sure this is the case if you pick up any book on yoga, you know how it's often said, even in modern yoga, that you can't pick up a
Yeah.
book and learn yoga. Well, it's also true, I think, with medieval texts. If put down the manuscript and try and try and do something that the text is telling you, well, then all of a sudden you realize that there are certain things missing. And so you say, well, what would the yogi do at that point? And how would the yogi do, the tapping, for example? Would it be, how high would the yogi lift the body and how quickly, even though it does say in the Amaraugha that it's done Shanaihi, which is or is that maybe that might be the Hatha Pradipika? I'm not sure in the Amaraugha, the word that's used for the tapping, but there's an element of interpretation there when you go to do it physically. So, um, so the basic practice is the three mudras. They're full body expressions, where, as you said before, mudras in earlier tantric traditions could refer to hand gestures. And there are some instances where mudra could be used to refer to bodily positions used, that were taught, but not as widely perhaps as the hand mudras. Or that meaning seems to have become more widely understood. And the first mudra is it's a forward bending position with one leg straight and the other leg bent at the knee and the perineum pressing against the heel, and the yogi leans forward and grabs the foot of the extended leg with both hands. So it's a little bit like the modern yoga posture, Janu Shirshasana.
Mm.
Um, and then the yogi takes a breath in, holds the breath, and applies the chin lock. So these mudras involve postural practice, but also breath retentions. And then, as it's clear when you read the descriptions, there are sort of bandhas locks, these physical methods of locking parts of the body. And in this case, with the first one, Mahamudra, you lock the breath in, if you like, by pressing the chin down into the chest. So the yogi holds breath, then breathes out, and then maintains the same position. So that was Mahamudra, takes the breath in, and then practices Mahabandha. And the difference here is that after breathing in, the yogi applies the chin lock and then additionally applies Mula Bandha, the root lock. So there are two bandhas applied for Mahabandha. Holds
You've
the breath
sealed the
in.
torso at the top and the bottom, and there's sort of a
Yes.
container in which alchemical processes might kick off.
Yes, that's right. Well, the breath is pushed down, towards the base of the spine, where the opening to the central channel is, with Maha Mudra, and then with Mahabandha, you start to lock the breath, press Mahabandha so that you begin, I suppose, this process of moving the breath upwards. But that of course is into the central channel. But that, of course, the upward movement of the breath is intensified, if you like, through Mahaveda, which is the third mudra in the sequence. And there the yogi changes position from having one leg extended, bends the knee, and comes into a position where both legs are the same, basically. In the Amrita Siddhi, it says the feet point down, so it's probably more of a squatting position, the toes being against the floor, the knees wide. But in the Amaraugha, it doesn't mention that. So it could be just a sort of a Baddha Konasana type seated position. The most important thing that both texts say is that, the yogi takes the breath in, places the hands even by the sides of the body, then lifts the body up and taps the perineum against the heels while the breath is being held. And this pushes the breath up through the central channel forcibly, because there are blockages within the central channel, 3 in fact, that have to be opened, cleared, in order for the breath to go to the top of the central channel. So that's essentially the practice of the 3 mudras, and they're supposed to be done together every 3 hours, 8 times. So you imagine that doing them together once would probably be 1 round. And then then it would be repeated.
And obviously, it depends how long you hold the breath, how long that takes.
Yes, and again, there's no instruction given for that. So I suppose these are the blank spaces that a guru would have to fill in. And perhaps there was no consensus at the time for exactly how long the breath should be held. Perhaps it was according, some texts just say yatha shakti, according to one's capacity. But perhaps in this case, gurus had different ideas about how long the breath should be held.
There was another key detail that you illustrated in the demonstration, which was that the yogi breathes in through the mouth, which is not something you often
Yes.
hear about in the world of yoga practice. And I wonder what you made of that, actually experientially doing it for yourself, and how that would relate to what you might privately be doing in your own yoga practice.
It is unusual, isn't it? Breathing in through the mouth, and particularly today with the whole breath, there seems to be a trend at the moment about breath work, isn't there? And people taping their mouths at night. And
mouth breathing is the enemy.
yes. And here we have a practice where you're supposed to breathe in through the mouth. It is quite interesting. I don't know why. I mean, if I have to speculate, the only explanation I can think is that one can take a fairly fast and full breath in through the mouth. It says that the exhalation should be slow. It doesn't mention that one breathes out through the nose, but because it doesn't say you also breathe out through the mouth, then I assume, that's the default position, that you usually breathe in any particular practice in and out through the nose. So I assume that the out breath is, slowly done through the nostrils, but the inhalation certainly done through the mouth. And perhaps that was done so that one could take a very full breath quite quickly, focus on holding, and then lengthen the exhalation.
Thank you. Yeah. And then the other dimension to it, which you were alluding to, obviously, is this subtle realm inside the yogic anatomy that consists primarily of this central channel that has to be um,
Mm.
the conduit for breath and vitality in its broader conception to go upwards, but also all manner of other things, depending on the tradition, might be going upwards. As you emphasize in the introduction to the book, one of the big distinctions between the Amrita Siddhi and the Amaraugha, not just their sort of religious tradition, but also what that implies for physical practice. One is all about the manipulation of basically sexual fluid upwards, and the other is trying to awaken some other force within the Kundalini.
Mm.
I wonder if you could say something about that distinction, whether it's actually basically, as far as you can determine, the same practice with a different framing, or whether something actually experientially different is said to happen.
Yes, well, experientially, it's hard to say much. Experientially, but certainly in the interpretation of the practice, there are big differences. And what we do see with the Amaraugha is the introduction of Shiva, some Shiva concepts, not just
Hmm.
with Hatha Yoga, but also Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga is basically a Shiva interpretation of samadhi, even though it's defined as Chitta Vritti Rahita, very similar to Patanjali Yoga when you get to the end of the text. And there's a couple of verses on Raja Yoga. It's, introduces the linga and other Shiva terms for samadhi. And one of the Shiva concepts that's introduced to Hatha Yoga is Kundalini, that Kundalini is struck like a snake by a stick through the practice of Mahamudra. The implication being that, she's asleep at the base of the spine, perhaps covering the mouth, even though that's not said in the text. And by striking her and straightening her, that is said that she's sort of struck by the stick and becomes straight, that you're moving her out the way, because the general idea is that she's blocking the entrance to the central channel. And then once she's out the way, you can start to move prana in through the central channel to clear um, the blockages. And of course, in other traditions, you can move Kundalini itself into, well, actually, in this tradition, I would say it's very much the case, because as the verse at the beginning of the text says, um, Shiva and Shakti should unite in the head.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, Kundalini probably was believed to go up through the central channel as well. Once the central channel had been cleared, the three knots, through pushing prana forcefully upwards in the practice of Mahaveda.
I guess the reason I ask is because one particularly prominent and influential modern yoga innovator, Krishnamacharya, was drawing on some textual precedents that almost describe it as you were initially. Kundalini is a blockage that has to be kind of dealt with, burned, was his theory, so that you don't have to deal with any of this stuff. Because obviously the word Kundalini has entered popular parlance these days, associated sometimes with quasi psychedelic, mind altering states, can be quite destabilizing. And therefore, it's perhaps not something to rush into and to try and awaken. And his view
Mm,
seemed to be, you don't need to do any of that to get to where you need to go with yoga. Obviously, there'd be a whole corpus of texts that would completely disagree with him. But then again, I do wonder, this is where I keep trying to sort of bring it back into the realm of the experiential. And I know that as a textual scholar, you might be reluctant to sort of build that bridge. But what actually does need to happen to achieve the desired results in yoga? Is Kundalini actually an integral part of the process, or is it just the way that some
mm.
texts talk about the process?
Well, I think it depends on the tradition, and Krishnamacharya is a good example because he's coming
Hmm.
from a more Vaishnava background.
Yeah.
Uniting Shiva and Shakti is not a priority for him. So if you're in a Shaiva lineage and that's the aim, then awakening Kundalini is necessary. I mean, even within the Shaiva tradition, as I mentioned, she's conceived as blocking the central channel in ordinary people who don't practice yoga. Her mouth covers the opening of the central channel. So yes, the Vaishnavas seem to take that on as necessary as well, that they believe that she was a blockage, got to get rid of her, and then you can start to move the breath into the central channel. And when the breath is moving in the central channel, that brings about samadhi. That's also common in both traditions. Rajayoga arises as the breath moves up through the central channel, piercing the knots. Once it's reached the highest knot, Rudra's knot between the eyebrows, it's at that point that Raja Yoga starts to ensue. And the breath moves in the central channel and stops moving in the nostrils, which is why one can continue to live in the state of samadhi in complete stillness with barely any movement, not only no mental movement, but also hardly any breathing and no physical movement. I think those ideas are quite not universal, but were probably more acceptable to a wider range of traditions. But when it comes to sort of moving Kundalini up through the central channel and uniting her with Shiva in the head, I think that's more a Shaiva view, more sort of sectarian in a sense, that you're wanting to aim towards that. And obviously, in the case of Krishnamacharya, he, wasn't into it, wasn't into that tradition.
And at the same time, though, I mean, there were texts, and you focused on one extensively in your doctoral research that basically said you don't need to bother with any of this stuff of messing around with subtle anatomy. It was very critical, this text, the Amanasika, of the methods that we would think of as Hatha yoga, breath control, mudras, and saying all you really need to do is to get into the state beyond the mind, the state in which the mind is not active. And that's a very well established, long-standing tradition for all of the centuries that yoga existed before Hatha yoga came into the mix, that you could get into a state beyond the mind without needing to move things around channels that may not be visible to modern medical machinery. So it's an interesting question for me, I suppose, as to how necessary some of these innovations in yogic anatomy are from the point of view of attaining the ultimate goals of yoga, given that there's a whole history of texts that say you can do that without activating any of this network.
Yes, well, that was the debate that's been going on for centuries, and it's I think valuable to see both sides of the argument. And the Amanaskar is a polemic text that doesn't give any quarter to other traditions, not just other yoga traditions such as Hatha yoga, but also any other soteriological tradition, whether it's the Vedas, the Upanishads, Vedanta, any philosophical tradition. It sees them all as a waste of time, because it doesn't because those traditions don't teach its basic practice, which is Shambhavi Mudra, a meditation technique where the yogi sits very still with the eyes half opened, half closed, so gazing out, but the meditative focus is internal, so gazing at an inward point, and sits basically like that, very still, until the mind dissolves, until this amanaskar state comes about. And the argument is that because the mind and the breath are connected, and that seems to have been universally accepted in all yoga traditions, the Hatha Pradipika and other Hatha texts will draw on that argument as a justification for pranayama. You stop the breath in order to stop the mind. Well, the Amanaskar saw it the other way. If you can stop the mind practicing Shambhavi Mudra, a meditation technique, and then the breath stops because the mind and the breath are connected, well, all this hard work that we do called pranayama is pointless, because you can achieve that incidentally, if you like, just through practicing on a very simple technique. And I think it was a compelling argument, but and Gnostics have also come up with their own sorts of arguments, similar arguments about knowledge, that if you know something, once you know it, you're liberated, and you don't have to learn it again. Whereas with yoga, the problem is we've got to keep practicing abhyasa, repeating a physical practice over and over again in order to achieve, um, samadhi. So there's from a Gnostic point of view, yoga is a lot of hard work, and from the Amanaskar's point of view, yoga was also a lot of hard work, particularly the pranayama, the mudras, the bandhas, and all those sorts of practices. Um, it's clear these traditions were in competition to some extent, were vying with one another. And the Yoga Bija is a very good example of the debate between gnosis and yoga. And
Mm.
why should you practice yoga if knowledge alone can lead to liberation? Why bother with yoga? It's superfluous. The goddess asks Shiva that question in the Yoga Bija point blank. And then
Mm.
Shiva has to sort of start coming up with some arguments to sort of say, oh, well, knowledge is important and it is needed, but, because the state of samsara, the soul is sort of trapped in doshas, in faults, in these sort of physical problems. uh, we need yoga to get rid of those. We need yoga to get rid of the doshas, not the Ayurvedic doshas. He defines what they are. They're things like anger, greed, death, um, suffering, happiness, all those sorts of things that define, I suppose, embodied existence. Um, but he makes the point, well, knowledge alone doesn't get rid of that. Gnostics are still subject to their body. They're still conquered by their body. They grow
Mm.
old and die. And if you're sitting in meditation and, an ant crawls onto your leg, well, knowledge alone won't get rid of that. You've got to swipe it off. So yoga was seen very much as from the Yoga Bija's point of view, a physical approach to achieving liberation that sort of placed the body and physicality at the center of the problem. And so it was seen very much as the physical practice was seen very much as a solution. That was the argument advanced in order to justify the need for yoga, even though Shiva concedes, yes, knowledge is also still needed. You need yoga and knowledge. One without the other is not sufficient. Um, he sort of basically ends up saying that yoga's the more important of the two. And
Mm.
if you go on the path of knowledge, it takes many lifetimes. It's very difficult. Um, it's a long path. Whereas if you take up the practice of yoga, particularly physical yoga, one lifetime's all that's needed. And so when seen from that perspective, suddenly, not only is, yoga a necessary accompaniment for achieving gnosis, it's sort of, it's seen through the lens of sort of doing it within one lifetime and being liberated while alive. It becomes the more important of the two.
Thanks. No, it's a really helpful summary, and I think there's a self-evident truth to a lot of people who've engaged in some form of physical practice that it's immediately an accessible thing. It's something you can engage with, and just to sit and stay in this kind of Shambhavi mudra practice. Transporting yourself to an inner understanding might sound more accessible, but in practice, a lot of people would find it very challenging, I think. Whereas it's much
Mm,
easier to, even in the modern yoga practice context, go to a class, make some shapes, have some, you know, physical benefits that can then transform into mental benefits. And so there is this obvious benefit to engaging with the body. And the Amrita Siddhi seems to say that. It says, that talks about in terms of the gunas, that the clarity of mind that is sattva is all well and good, but we've got a body that's dominated by rajas and tamas, so overactivity and inertia. And unless you can deal with that through the body, all the highfalutin talk about sattvas is going to be a nice idea rather than a reality. Somehow they have to be balanced out of their problematic kind of extremes, the other two gunas. And so I think there's a lot to be said for it. And I suppose that takes me into another realm of sort of teasing out distinctions between scholarship and practice. In that, you were yourself obviously a yoga practitioner at the time you were working on the Amaraugha, and that was something you were engaged with for quite a while, because you wrote in a way two different theses on it, starting out as I think an honours extension to your original degree in Australia, and then at the University of Oxford for your DPhil. And I wonder how it squared with you as somebody who had been practicing physical yoga, found it very beneficial. I heard you talk about it helping you very much with previous difficulties with asthma, and yet at the same time working on a text that says breath techniques are a complete waste of time. How did you balance those two things? Is that where the need to separate the scholarship from the practice kicked in, or were there other ways in which you could reconcile the two perspectives?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose I could see both sides of the argument. And, at the time I also had quite a strong meditation practice that
Mm,
I'd learned through Buddhist traditions, particularly Zen.
mm,
And, of course, so that dynamic between the physical and meditative path, if you like, between, the sort of um, dichotomy, if you like, between Rajayoga and Hatha Yoga still exists today in some respects, where you can go to a yoga class and do a very physical class, and there may be no meditation, or there might be
mm,
some relaxation at the end with Shavasana. But you could go to some classes for a long time and not learn much about meditation. Then you go to, say, a Buddhist monastery or a Buddhist
mm,
class, or it could be mindfulness or something. And then all of a sudden you could start to learn a lot about meditation. Um, and of course, their main practice is meditation. So they do a retreat and they're basically sitting. They may not be practicing Shambhavi Mudra, but they're practicing a meditation technique for long hours each day, which, as you said, can be very challenging, very difficult to sit still for long hours. The body becomes sore, and you've got to struggle with fatigue or mental, the mind going bananas and all that sort of thing while you're trying to focus on one thing. And that's their practice. And some people do that quite successfully, don't they? As
mm,
probably know Buddhist circles where they've been practicing like that for 40 or 50 years, and they can sit very still for long periods of time. So that's really how I understood the Amanaskar's critique of Hatha Yoga, and how I suppose I understand the Yoga Bija's response. Um, and my personal view is, I suppose I side with the Yoga Bija, that I think both, are necessary, or it's good to have both. Maybe
mm,
necessary is too strong. No, you can do the Gnostic path or the meditation alone path. Yes, that's possible. And might I add, the system of four yogas, to some extent, in the Amaraugha and other texts, accounts for that, or provides both views, or accommodates both
mm,
views, if you like. Because if we take this system of four students, those with the least capabilities being given mantra yoga, and the most capable student being given Raja Yoga, well, the implication of that system is that, I suppose, a guru assesses the student, and if a student's extremely capable, that student's given Raja Yoga. So in a sense, they bypass the other three yogas in that particular system.
mm,
In other systems, it was different. It was a sort of a one size fits all for Hatha Yoga, such as in the Hatha Pradipika. Everybody has to do Hatha Yoga, and perhaps that accommodated everybody by having a wider range of practices to give people. So that, there were the Shat Karma, more asanas, 8 kumbhakas, and so forth, and 10 mudras, instead of just the rudimentary practices that we see in the Amaraugha. So yes, I feel personally, I feel that if you're going to go down the path of meditation, having a physical practice is very beneficial. And then if you've got greater capability to do a physical practice on in a more in-depth way, with more complex practices such as headstand or kumbhakas with the application of bandhas and so forth, then that gives you access to some advantages that others don't have, and can be very helpful for meditation. Um, so so yes, I suppose even though I studied the Amanaska in depth, it didn't I didn't become a, uh, a devotee of its teachings.
Thank you, thank you. And I suppose that leads me on to the other domain that I'm really curious about, particularly in light of seeing you demonstrating to clarify points, not just in the Amaraugha, but also at the recent launch of the new digital edition of the Haṭha Pradipika. Um, there was a demonstration you had there to sort of show how it had clarified some of the instructions for Matsyendrasana, the twisting posture. And yeah, it just makes me curious about whether there's potential actually as a scholar practitioner for offering some kind of insight into, you know, the application of, let's say, an older or, earlier, or perhaps even to some extent, I mean, these words are, not very helpful, and I'm sure as a scholar you'll quibble with them. But perhaps we could say purer, as in, from the beginnings of Hatha Yoga, a pure Hatha Yoga approach, as opposed to Hatha Yoga combined with many other influences, as happens in subsequent centuries. Whether there's some benefit to that. Again, at the launch of the Amaraugha, I think somebody asked you whether you knew of anybody in India who was sort of still doing this three mudra
Mm,
practice, and I think you said no, and it would be surprising if they were, because so many other practices have come along in the meantime. But
mm,
you mentioned the Buddhist context, and there are a number of people in that world. There's one who I'm currently taking a course with, German scholar monk Analayo, who's tried to build a sort of modern practice out of the Satipatthana Sutta. So to try and reorient mindfulness towards the Buddha's ideas about full awakening in a way, but whether that's necessarily attainable in the 9-week course is, of course, another question. But I wonder, is there something that could be put together from that perspective about early Hatha Yoga oriented to a modern practitioner audience that is really trying to get down to the absolute basics of the most effective techniques from the original repertoire, with the same sort of orientation towards the results that's implied in the title of these texts?
mm. Yes, well, I think the texts can be a sort of an interesting lens for a lot of practitioners to sort of look through and see some of the practices that they've learnt in a modern context, to see them differently. And I also think the texts can offer some different ways of doing things. So Matsyendrasana is a good example, just by a variant reading that we think is very early in the transmission of the Haṭha Pradipika, and makes actually much better sense once that reading is restored, but is actually not, that reading is not in the more recent versions of the Haṭha Pradipika that have been printed in the 20th century that
Mm.
that people have been reading. This early reading provides, I think, perhaps a slightly different way of how the pose was done, where perhaps the arms and the legs were. And I think the Hatha Abhyasa is a very good example of postures
Mm.
that haven't made it into modern yoga that are interesting to explore. Also, some of the teachings of the medieval texts, as you would know, haven't really been emphasized or even made it into some of the modern styles, such as applying the bandhas during kumbhaka in a
Mm.
particular way, starting with chin lock, then applying all three, and then emphasizing Uddiyana at the end of the kumbhaka, and maintaining Uddiyana for the beginning of the exhalation. Those sort of teachings, I think, can give modern practitioners different ideas about what they're doing, and I think many practitioners realize that often they have to go to different styles of modern yoga to get a fuller picture of the practice in some ways, because I think the modern styles are often offering a slice of yoga, if you like, or a particular way of doing it, and then as soon as you go to another style, you see a slightly different way, or maybe a very different way of doing something, and it may suit you much better. You may get greater benefit from it. Um, I know that brings up the whole question of whether one does just one style or does all sorts of tries all the styles. But I think if one's into that approach, if one has some experience, knows the basics, then the texts can offer different perspectives, different insights into practices that are taught today. And personally, I found that very helpful in my own practice, and I hope others do as well.
I would agree with you in both of those respects. Also, from that point of view of, let's say, dabbling in multiple approaches, I found that quite liberating. Having sort of initially tried to stick to the you should have one, well, I didn't manage one teacher, but at least one school of yoga. And as soon as I mean, that's what got me interested in the academic approach in the end, was hearing conflicting information from multiple sources and realizing actually that's what the history of yoga has always been. There's all sorts of different perspectives on things, and none of them is necessarily right, which is why I hesitated to use the pure word earlier, because there's obviously no such thing as, the one pure yoga. And then also to be enriched by some of these ideas from texts is something we can be open to, rather than having to just stay in your lane and take it on doctrinal terms.
Mm.
And I know you've been doing that. You were offering a course on the yogic breath and how that sort of fits together from a textual perspective. And I just wonder if you might do more of that. And in relation to the Hatha Paddhati, it seemed a little bit like the influence was the other way around, almost through exploring some of the techniques to try and understand what the text was getting at. Originally, I think there were workshops where you're reading the verses and just seeing what people did in response to the instructions to see which might be the most logical interpretation. And
Mm.
I wonder though what it would be like to take it the other way around and to say, we've got this information, could we put together a practice that would be helpful and interesting and present it as something worth engaging in.
Well, I actually hope that yoga teachers can do that. I I would like to sidestep that a particular task, if it is one, and
Fair enough.
hope that those that are teaching and really engaged more with the practice. I mean, I practice for myself, but I don't think about how my own practice might affect other people, uh, and I don't teach yoga in a class situation anymore. So I prefer people who've got those, who are doing that for a living and have those skills at their fingertips. I hope that they can take my research, my work, and in some way, perhaps it influences what they might do or what they might experiment with, even in their own practice. Um, yes, I suppose that's why I've been reluctant to offer a class teaching what I think might be a medieval practice. But with the Hatha Paddhati, it was very beneficial for us to work
Mm.
with yoga practitioners and a lot of teachers to see what they thought of the poses. Because often just by trying to work out a description or an illustration within their own body and with their experience, they came up with some, I think in some cases, better interpretations than what I had at the time just reading the Sanskrit. And this, that's partly because the Sanskrit itself is very terse and
Mm.
it can be ambiguous and so forth. And so it was really my wife, Jacqueline Hargreaves, who came up with that idea to start practicing it and offer it to offer workshops for yoga teachers and students to to see what they could make of it and to present the evidence first. That was actually the way she approached the class or the workshop. And I think it worked really well. And I was surprised at how much I learnt through those workshops.
Oh, thank you, thank you. One last question that throws up for me is obviously this challenge of not only spanning centuries and cultural differences, but the linguistic barrier of going particularly from Sanskrit sources into modern vernacular that's comprehensible to the world of practitioners. And I wonder how you again balance that. I mean, obviously, as a scholar, your responsibility is to the text and trying to stay as close as you can get to the meaning that you're discerning from the original. Um, and yet, obviously, you want your work to be read. So,
Mm,
how do you navigate this tension between, being a stickler for accuracy, and obviously in scholarly translation that involves things like square brackets around any words you might
mm.
have to add to make things a bit clearer, and at the same time the need for readability and accessibility and comprehensibility if you want people to engage with your work in the way that you were just describing.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance because on the one hand, one wants to sort of present the text as one's reading it in Sanskrit. And so you think about word order, and you often start with a very literal translation, and you try and replicate as much as what you see in the Sanskrit in the English that you're using to translate the verse. And then often once you've done that, you read it and you think, gosh, somebody who's reading that without knowing the Sanskrit's not really going to understand, any of it, or what the verse is saying. So you then have to go about trying to capture the meaning of the verse in English so that an English speaker can, understand the basic ideas that are being conveyed. And I find that really that challenge, it's absolutely painful
Mm.
to struggle with. And I often I might translate a verse a dozen times to try and get that balance right. um, and often an easy solution is just to be very free. If the Sanskrit's a bit awkward, or there's an archaic um, sort of turn of phrase or something within the original language, you might try and render that very freely. But then, of course, the question of, well, how accurate is that, or does that really was that really what was in the author's mind when the text was being written? That then becomes an issue, and sometimes, um, particularly when you think more about the verse and what it actually means, you suddenly realize that no, that probably wasn't intended. So I find that the hardest part of the work, actually, in many respects. Collating, even the editing process, and typesetting and all that's very mechanical and time consuming, and we spend a lot of time doing that. But it's refining the translation, um, that's the hardest. And the best for me, the best way of doing that is to read the text with as many other people as possible, particularly other specialists, to get their opinion on, not only what the verses might mean and how the problems with verses can be solved, but also the best way of rendering a verse into English. That can be, as lengthy a discussion as the history, around the verse or the problems within the verse itself, just trying to work out how to translate it. Um, so it's a big part of the work, big challenge that I think all translators, particularly of ancient languages, where you're going into a different world, where beliefs, uh, forms of expression and communication were so different, and you're trying to render it for a modern audience.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's I think also testament to this collective wisdom on which we can draw, whether it's in the world of scholarship or in a broader understanding of how to relate what we learn from that to the outside world. You described that in the context of the workshops with yoga practitioners, but also in these scholarly workshops where you're, workshopping translations. It's, although yoga is often, it's very individualistic in a way. It's, one's practice and almost, renouncing engagement with the world. The process of, trying to excavate an understanding of that world in which ancient yogis were operating is very much a team effort, it seems. And
Mm.
yeah, we all learn from one another. And it's in that context that I'm really grateful for your contribution to that teamwork, because it continually brings up new things to think about. Even this conversation, I've already got several new ideas for things to go and explore in more depth. And I just wanted to ask, before we sign off, where people might go if they want to find out more about what you're doing. I know you and Jackie had a website, the Luminescent. Is that still a good portal through which people can engage with you, or is there anywhere else you'd point
Yes,
them to?
yes, we're still posting things on the Luminescent. So that's where Jackie takes a piece of our research and that she thinks, may be of interest to a wider audience, and writes a blog post on it, or just announces maybe a publication or something that's in the pipeline. Also, my academia.edu page is another place to access articles and books, although in the case of the Amaraugha, there's only 15% of the book available at the moment. That book will become a digital version of that book will become available January of next year for those who can't afford a hard copy, or who want the sort of convenience of using a digital copy. So I'll release that January of next year. And yes, all my publications are also available on the Luminescent. So that's a sort of, I suppose, one website that has not only publications but also blog posts and also links to to Jackie's social media sites and so forth on Facebook and Instagram.
Super. Well, I'll link to all of that in the notes that will accompany this, and hopefully also to the video of you demonstrating the
Yes.
mudras. That would be really good as well.
Yep. Happy
If-
to send you that.
Super. Well, for now, just remains for me to thank you once again for really stimulating conversation, and for everything you've been contributing to the world of understanding, the world of ancient yogis.
Well, my pleasure. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, to talk to somebody with a deep interest in the history and a deep knowledge of it. Makes the conversation for me, very interesting and exciting. And as I say, makes the research worthwhile to be able to engage with someone like yourself, who's got such a strong interest in it. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks again.